Yes, we have a wonderful third day planned for everyone, starting with this first session, which is session 5, Women and Identity. So our first panelist is Amanda Lee Morrill. Amanda Lee Morrill is an NYC-based drummer and percussionist, finishing her third year of doctoral studies in ethnomusicology at Columbia University. Her research focuses primarily on freelance musicians' labor and cultural hierarchy within U.S. musical theater. And the title of Amanda's talk today is Every Tudor Rose Has Its Thorns, White Stream Mean Girl Feminism in Six. Please welcome Amanda.
All right, this talk begins a little more aggressively than I would at 9 a.m., so thank you for being here. I really appreciate you. Listen up. Let me tell you a story that you think you've heard before. These lyrics from Ex-Wives, the opening number of Six, the musical, serve two purposes. First, they set the scene for what will undoubtedly be a highly anachronistic musical experience. Within the show's universe, Henry VIII's wives have assembled in the present to form a 21st century pop supergroup. Second, these lines promise to challenge any preconceived notions the audience may hold about Six's queens. In writing Six, Toby Marlowe and Lucy Moss urged audiences to question the reliability of male historians who narrate past women's lives. Men like David Starkey have presented gendered assumptions about Henry VIII's wives as foregone conclusions. Six challenges the authority of these narratives by offering alternative readings of each queen. To maximize relatability, each character inflects her story with 21st century slang and sensibilities. Though predominantly female audiences around the globe praise Six for its themes of female empowerment, the musical's viability as a feminist text is highly contested among critics and scholars. Six started out as a 60-minute fringe theater passion project for two Cambridge University students. Now a global phenomenon and highly successful commercial enterprise, its creators have earned all the rewards associated with a smash hit, including a closer level of scrutiny than they ever anticipated. Six has been charged with containing a faulty feminist message, leading some scholars to sentence the musical to death, while others rush to its aid. I am not exaggerating. In her frequently cited analysis, Grace Barnes argues that when it comes to Six, the term feminist is being used incorrectly by commentators and Moss, purely because the show deviates from the more familiar model that focuses on a male story. In fact, for Barnes, it remains impossible to fathom how Six could ever be labeled feminist by supposedly informed critics. Quoth the queens, rude. A story that you think you've heard before also fittingly describes this paper, which adds yet one more analysis of Six's feminism to a fairly vast collection. However, despite the precedent established by numerous scholars before me, my task today is neither to outright condemn nor rescue Six. As an ethnomusicologist who primarily focuses on theater musicians' labor, I am not particularly interested in evaluating individual musicals' feminist merit. Also, as a working drummer and potential candidate for Maria on the drums in some future production of Six, I'd prefer to keep my queen cards fairly close to the vest. Instead, I would like to do what few scholars have yet done and view Six through an intersectional feminist lens. An intersectional approach is necessary for dealing with Six, which, in addition to unbinding its Tudor queens from time and space, also erases and re-races their whiteness. Within musical theater studies and criticism, virtually every author links Six to Hamilton. This is because both shows make a point of casting Black actors and actors of color in the roles of historical figures identified as white. However, whereas Hamilton generated significant backlash for its portrayal of men invested in the slave trade, Six has managed to evade similar charges for its re-raced proto-imperialist monarchs. You can debate the proto, I'm not a historian. If few scholars have taken up race in Six, even fewer have noted its narrative investment in material wealth and consumer capitalism. That investment is particularly at home on Broadway, which represents not just the epicenter of professional theater in the United States, but also a $1.5 billion industry. With this paper, I aim to enrich previous analyses of Six by introducing to its discourse works by Angela Davis, Sandy Grande, and Kim Hong Nguyen. Informed by these scholars, I reject analyses that frame Six either as a depiction of bad feminism or as an earnest transition from bad feminism to good feminism. Instead, I argue that Six's feminist message is far more complicated from beginning to end, and it empowers the queens to strategically deceive their audiences in order to deliver lessons about women's autonomy and gendered assumptions. In this presentation, I will first demonstrate that even as Six's queens verbally enact tropes of competition and infighting, they use visual and musical displays of solidarity to covertly communicate their support for one another. The show supports this reading during Six's 11 o'clock number, when the queens essentially wink at their audience to reveal both their artifice and the coordinated effort behind it. However, the queens' self-empowerment is compromised by their investment in white stream, mean girl feminism, mean girl feminist priorities and tactics, and I will elaborate these terms as we go. Six's feminism, steeped in individualism, proto-imperialism, and consumer capitalism, ultimately stifles the queen's ability to collectively imagine a truly utopic ending. Finally, I will prove that white stream, mean girl feminism pervades not just the musical's narrative, but also its marketing and advertising strategies on Broadway. In order to present an alternative intersectional reading of Six, it is necessary to address previous critiques of the show's feminism. In her 2020 article, Barnes delineates common criticisms of Six. It defames the queens by sexualizing, infantilizing, and dumbing them down. It trivializes the misogynist violence and sexual abuse they endured, particularly in the songs All You Want to Do and Don't Lose Your Head. Even worse, it appears to glorify Henry, especially during Jane Seymour's power ballad, Heart of Stone. Do we have Six fans in the house? Okay. Do we have people who guilty pleasure won't admit to it but do know Six? Okay, awesome, thank you. Just wanted to know. It defines women by their relationships to their male abuser. And finally, it pits women against each other for the majority of its 80-minute duration. In the time allotted, I can only address a few of these concerns. Though I ran this talk with my twin last night and she said, you touch on more of the concerns than you think you do, and please get someone to ask you about Heart of Stone. So that's her recommendation. Okay, for Barnes, presenting the singers as a sexual spectacle negates any power they may have gained by reducing them to versions of a sadomasochistic male fantasy. No matter what the wives sing, their costumes define them as subservient to the will of a man. On that point, I beg to differ. In her writings on classic blues, Angela Davis established historical precedent for the use of playful music and humorous lyrics in songs which recount historical violence against women. Davis could have been describing Six when she wrote, "It is true that some of the songs seem to exemplify acceptance of male violence, and sometimes even masochistic delight in being the target of lovers' beatings. However, it is important to look beyond the text since, as Davis observes, such claims do not take into account the extent to which blues meaning is manipulated and transformed, sometimes even into its opposite, in blues performance." Here, Davis makes a case for considering the tension between the words a performer sings and the subversive choices she makes in her vocal delivery and ironic performance of the text. This is an especially generative practice for musical theater analysis, which can sometimes depend too exclusively on the script and lyrics as they are. While a text-only reading of Catherine Howard's All You Want to Do appears to glorify the sexualization and abuse of minors, the staging and choreography of the number in live performance combined with the actor's facial expressions and vocal delivery, make it very clear, in a way that's not clear on the cast recordings necessarily, that Howard's awareness, resentment, and despair grow stronger with each new sexual predator she encounters. Similarly, while Barnes condemns Anne Boleyn's "Don't lose your head" for trivializing violence against women through its cheeky, playfully rebellious tone, Davis explains that blues makes abundant use of humor, satire, and irony, revealing their historic roots in slave music, wherein indirect methods of expression were the only means by which the oppression of slavery could be denounced. Six is not a blues musical, though I would argue that a sonic link to Black American popular music is present throughout the show. In any case, the women it portrays were not enslaved. Still, their sexual and reproductive autonomy was severely limited, and their literal survival depended on never crossing Henry VIII. Davis's work provides context for why Six's queens, like classic blues singers before them, might tap into indirect methods of expression in order to denounce their oppression. If scholars working from the text alone have a hard time locating solidarity between Six's queens, it is because in Six, solidarity is shown rather than told. Though they hurl pithy remarks and make jokes at one another's expense, these women spend most of the show's 80 minutes moving together in close formation and highly coordinated steps. They provide backup vocals for each other, and they listen intently to one another's life stories and vulnerabilities. Six's strategic use of nonverbal cues to destabilize its text is further reinforced by the musical's narrative grand reveal. If you haven't seen it, there are slime tutorials. I didn't want to include one in this presentation at the Library of Congress. The Queens pause Catherine Parr's solo feature, "I Don't Need Your Love," just before its final verse and reflect on their predicament. They lament that, had they not given into infighting and competition, they could have instead, quote, like reclaimed our stories and become the leading ladies. If only we'd thought of that before, close quote. At this point, they freeze, facing each other for a few seconds before casting a dramatic sidelong glance to the audience and leaning in. This moment confirms that all along, Six's queens have been following and visually, musically undermining a script of their own devising. This allows them to illustrate and immediately subvert the expectations placed upon them by patriarchal societies of the past and the present. Based on the applause this moment earns during performances of Six, the maneuver is successful. Still, it is not necessarily bulletproof as an act of feminism. Two terms introduced by Sandy Grande and Kim Hong Nguyen, respectively, help illuminate the limitations of Six's brand of feminism. Grande, identifying herself as not a feminist, but rather indigena, describes white stream feminism as a feminist discourse that is not only dominated by white women, but also principally structured on the basis of white middle-class experience, serving their ethnopolitical interests and capital investments. White people may not dominate Six's casts necessarily, but they have historically dominated its creative teams and its onstage bands. And like most of the shows which came before it, and many shows to follow, West End and Broadway productions of Six cater to those scenes predominantly white middle-class patrons. Though Six strives to include and represent a wide variety of women on stage through its racially diverse casting, this measure alone does not strip the show of its whiteness or its white streamness. Furthermore, fans have detected casting trends in professional productions of Six which raise concerns about colorism and unintentional stereotyping. And I'll linger here for a second so you can look through these. There are professional productions of Six which subvert these, and this article was published in 2020. So since then, many different women have tackled many of Six's roles, but it took a long time. I believe this article says it took 3 years to cast a non-white actress as Jane Seymour, who is the purest of the queens in most readings. So something to think about, but a little out of date. In classifying Six as a decidedly white stream feminist musical, my goal is not to personally implicate Marlowe and Moss or to denigrate their efforts. Rather, I aim to implicate the broader theater industry, highlighting the whiteness of institutions like the Edinburgh Fringe, the West End, and Broadway. Given that socioeconomic context, it should come as no surprise that Six's feminist perspective is white stream. Kim Hong Nguyen characterizes mean girl feminism as a particular kind of white feminism that has gone awry. According to Nguyen, the figure of the mean girl takes the tropology of resistance for herself by stealing racialized modes of protest. Mean girl feminism frees the damsel in distress bound by cis heteropatriarchy by transforming her into a damsel in resistance who performs tactics of racialized resistance to gendered oppression. I argue that Six's erasing and re-erasing of 16th century monarchs' whiteness represents a dramatized form of the theft that Nguyen describes. Six's casting indeed helps transform its damsels in distress to damsels in resistance. However, it also helps mask Henry's wife's complicity in his political conquests and proto-imperialist agenda. After all, no matter how playfully rebellious and sympathetically they are presented in Six, the actual Tudor queens benefited from and often supported Henry VIII's proto-imperialist tyrannical politics. Of course, I am not suggesting that Six abandon its diverse casting. Diversifying musical theater across the axes of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class, and disability is a major priority for me in my performance career and my research. And of course, I echo Julie Taymor's thoughts about what it means to depict royalty on stage as Black or as a person of color. And I have to give a shout out to Dr. Ely and Dr. Proctor. We should, of course, celebrate the joy, the humor, and the labor of Black performers in Six, especially, but all women of color involved. I only mean to suggest that re-racing history provides just as complicated in Six as it does in Hamilton, yet only the latter has yielded significant backlash. In her rather celebratory examination of race in Six, Stephanie Russo suggests that it is rather easier to depoliticize Henry VIII's queens than it is America's founding fathers. I argue that the tactics of white stream, mean girl feminism facilitate this gendered depoliticization of Six's monarchs. Describing the third wave feminism that informs Six, Grande notes that, quote, the issues of white women's racial privilege and complicity in the colonialist project remain unaddressed, close quote. In its form and content, Six does not challenge Grande's claim. My final consideration of Six's white stream, mean girl feminism is how it reflects and intersects with Broadway's own commercialism. As Valerie Schrader notes, at the end of the musical, the queens re-envisioned their lives as pop stars, living fulfilling lives of fame and fortune and using their talents to obtain a capitalistic dream. They must pursue these capitalistic dreams separately since, as Schrader observes, Six emphasizes the popular feminist traits of individualism, commercialism, and entrepreneurism. Nowhere are these values communicated more clearly than in the Broadway production's Royalty Rewards program. In February of 2024, Six announced a program meant to entice fans back into the seats of the Lena Horne Theater over and over and over again. During the first year of the program, fans could earn prizes for attending Six as many as 30 times in one calendar year. And it's 30 visits. Buying a ticket for yourself and your friend 15 times does not count. This was not the first show-specific rewards program on Broadway. It's often called that. The short-lived Here Lies Love briefly offered collectibles for patrons who purchased packages of 4 tickets. However, Six's program lifted Broadway's commercialism to new heights, capitalizing on girl boss self-care feminism. Fantasies, self-care fantasies. Maybe they're feminist, maybe they're not. Treat yourself. In 2024, the top tier's prizes included an overnight stay in a Times Square hotel, signed production memorabilia, a makeup consultation with complimentary cosmetics, chocolate, flowers, and more. My initial reaction to this program echoed Catherine of Aragon in the show. Surely there's no way anyone would see a single Broadway production 30 times in 1 year and need a hotel room in Times Square. However, much to my surprise, plenty of social media users celebrated the news, and some begged for the launch of a similar program on the West End. Some said they'd already done that before the program was announced. Wow. Currently, Six's royalty program remains exclusive to Broadway, and the 2025 rewards have been pared down substantially. This year's top prize for 26 visits is a custom denim jacket that promises to make you look like royalty. I don't have it. I've seen it once. Like it or not, Six's white stream mean girl feminism continues to thrive on the Great White Way. The production has long since recouped its initial investment and is currently approaching, like almost as we speak, its 1500th performance. Six may not be the feminist text scholars wanted, but it is certainly one that reflects the societies surrounding it. Once again, my goal today was not to evaluate Six's merit as a feminist text. Instead, I hope to have shown that with an intersectional approach, critiques of Six's feminism can raise far more interesting questions than, are the costumes too sexy? If that comment feels somewhat mean girl spirited, I respectfully offer the following quote from Six's Anne Boleyn. Sorry, not sorry about what I said. Don't lose your head. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. We have a few minutes for questions, and I'm just going to ask the Heart of Stone one because because you've kind of said about the difference between in performance and lyrics, and how in performance they may destabilize the meaning of the lyrics. And I'm curious if in Heart of Stone you see that happening, or if you see it more straightforward as like a power ballad in Six.
Yeah, definitely in the case of Heart of Stone, there actually are verbal call-outs. Every single time Jane Seymour says something about how she was in love with Henry VIII, or just something about their life together that's positive, one of the other queens immediately responds with a reminder that he was beheading women. So the show will not let you forget about his evils, and whatever Jane Seymour's narrative is, it immediately throws you back into that counter-narrative. But also the song itself, to bring it back to Angela Davis, she talks about how in a lot of classic blues songs, there are these anthems, power ballads almost, about like staying with an abusive lover and continuing to receive his beatings almost gratefully. But she talks about, even within those songs, there's a celebration of newly liberated, former slaves' autonomy, because these women were enduring beatings and enduring violence from their sexual partners or from people who purported to own them, regardless. And sexual liberation, Davis says, was one of the most immediate lived changes for a liberated person. So I think that there's precedent established in American popular music that Six taps into, maybe not completely avoiding a problematic tone.
Thank you. Thank you for, so many questions.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It was fantastic, and I really appreciate that you were, threading the needle as it were. And I also really appreciated your attention to the performance, because I think you're absolutely right. The performance completely contradicts the lyrics, and so thanks for that.
Thank you.
I recently this past semester, I taught a class on musical theater and fan cultures, so I'm a little bit defensive and anxious about kind of the pathologizing of the superfan.
Yes.
And I'm curious, what do you think this musical does for the fans? Why would people come and see this show so many times? And I do know from research that super fans are often not wealthy. They're
Right.
just people who prioritize going to see a show over and over
Yes.
again. So I would love to hear your thoughts about the. And I'm not suggesting that you pathologize.
No,
them.
I did.
When I saw those things come up, I was like, "Oh my God,
It's
really?"
quite overwhelming.
I could barely sit through the show one time. But anyway, but with my students who loved it and
Yes.
all bought all the merch and all the things. Anyway,
Yes.
I would love to hear you talk about the fans.
Thank you. It's very exciting to answer a question from you, I have to say. I've read your work, and I don't know, I'm geeking out a little bit. I don't understand the appeal because truly in my mindset, I think the most I've seen any production is maybe Happy Ending. I think I've seen it 3 times now. But I was bringing family that hadn't seen it, and my twin sister's a lighting designer, and she was the assistant on that show. So she's amazing. Oh my gosh. And so like I can't understand that level of fan culture, and I have a hard. I don't even know how many movies I've seen 30 times. So for me, I think it's just different. I don't want to say programming because that does sound pathologizing, but I do think it also speaks to the power of representation. I also think it speaks to the intelligence of 6 viewers. I think, again, people who go 30 times, they're picking up on every expression of solidarity that they see on stage. They are picking up on the non-textual elements of not female competition, but subverting female competition. And the fandom of 6 has a phrase that's in the new song they just released, which I only just listened to, where they say they fix each other's crowns. I don't think 6 invented that phrase, but they use that a lot as a fandom. I think that culture is something people are responding to. And you're right, economically, I think a lottery ticket for 6 can be as low as $40 before fees, but you're still spending at least $1,300 in a year. But hey, some people have a coffee habit. Who am I to judge?
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for this paper. It was so fascinating. I was wondering how much you've looked at the show structurally, because like one thing when I saw 6, I see how it's trying to build off of the same structure of that sense of competition that we see in shows like A Chorus Line and Cats, and how much race and gender are also very important to those shows. So I was wondering if you've looked at the structure and that sense of competition versus solidarity.
All I can say is that I read so many analyses of 6 before I actually got to see it on Broadway. And when I finally got to see it, I just felt that all of those analyses were way too in the text, and it subverted everything that they were, almost everything they were positing. Of course, there are wonderful things about these analyses, but like also some of them are mean girl feminism to me, I'm not usually deep in the canon. So I don't know that I've done all the structural work I should have done, but I like the similarities you pointed out between those other shows. It's something I should think more about. Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question, or? I know there are more questions, but I also didn't.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm embarrassed to admit I don't know what the gender breakdown of the creators was of 6.
Yes, actually, this is important because a lot of these analyses don't necessarily get this right. Toby Marlowe is non-binary and is out as non-binary and has been since accepting the Tony. And I still see analyses assigning male gendered pronouns to them, and I would like to see less of that. And then Lucy Moss is a woman. So those are the show's 2 main creators. They've been with it from its inception, and as far as I know, involved with each professional production that's gone on. And 6 uniquely it has so many professional productions. There's not just Broadway and the West End, but there are residential shows basically in other countries, and the cruise ships and the tours, multiple international tours and domestic. So lots of white people on those creative teams. You can Google them. That's what I did. Sit there and Google every name. Lots of white people. It's okay. I'm a white person. We can be.
And with that, let's give another round of applause to Amanda. Thank you. All right. Our next paper is by Catherine M. Young. Catherine M. Young is a theater historian who studies popular entertainments, including musicals, circus, and vaudeville. Her writing appears in several journals and edited collections, and her co-edited and translated book, Goethe and the Poodle, Albert Linder's The Dog of Aubrey, 1869, will be published later this year by Peter Lang. Congratulations. And the title of Catherine's paper is Sex and Stuckness, the Mobility and Immobilization of Women in the Heights. Please welcome Catherine.
So, show of hands, not for the folks on Zoom, but for the folks in the room, who here knows the musical In the Heights? Okay, awesome. I love to see it. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to front load some brief clips so that to try to avoid tech issues, and then I just want you to hold the clips in your eyes, ears, and heart during my presentation. So here we have Mandy Gonzalez singing a little bit of her opening song, Breathe. Oh, hold on.
When I sing, I had a really, really hard time when they first came here. Neither of them spoke English.
This is the performer KO. They're non-binary. They came out as non-binary in 2021. And they are playing Vanessa, who is the secondary romance character in the musical.
Me from the Chevrolet, one day I'm hopping in a limousine and I'm riding away. Yeah, it won't be long now.
So this perfectly resonates with Amanda's talk about how the text is doing something different than the performance. And what I would just really would like folks to focus on is the bodily autonomy and agency of the female dancers in this very brief dancing sequence. Okay, so there we've just seen Mandy Gonzalez and KO doing their singing and dancing. And if I can bring up one more little thing. What's really important about this extremely brief clip is the response of the audience when Mandy Gonzalez comes out onto the fire escape at the top of Act 2, okay? So this is a new budding romance, and the audience is here for it, okay? And so that... hear the audience being like, what? Oh my gosh, because the line is, are you ready to try again? Very suggestive. The laughs are from audience members who understand Spanish and are understanding that what she was referring to was a Spanish lesson. Okay, so let's see if I can just get us a little...
Calor, heat, anoche, la last night. Dolor, pain. That's right.
Okay, that's it. Thank you for humoring me. All right, now we are going to look at the presentation as the slide deck has it. So In the Heights holds a unique place in Broadway history. In a musical about what home means, composer and lyricist Lin-Manuel Miranda and librettist Chiara Alegria Hudes depict 3 generations of Cuban American, Puerto Rican, and Dominican American women with specific desires and anxieties about mobility, and each woman sings at least one song. There is the confused first-generation college student, Nina Rosario, Mandy Gonzalez wearing a t-shirt and vest in the photo, the yearning beautician Vanessa, K.O. wearing a tank top and denim skirt, the dedicated community caregiver Abuela Claudia, Olga Maredes wearing yellow, and Nina's stalwart mother, Camila Rosario, Priscilla Lopez in the center photo. In the Heights premiered at Richard Rodgers Theater March 9, 2008, and won 4 Tonys. Scholars have analyzed In the Heights from a variety of vantage points. Elena Machado Saez critiques the musical's, quote, crossover aesthetics and what she sees as its crisis of imagination and authority on the part of U.S. Latinx middle-class cultural creatives, while Stacey Wolf's feminist analysis identifies the show's references and adherence to conventional musical theater heterosexual pairing with the primary couple and the secondary couple. And Colleen Rua characterizes the musical as, quote, enacting a performance of care, defiant joy, and belonging. My presentation extends Wolf's feminist analysis and Rua's embrace of defiant joy with specific attention to the generational representation of women's mobility. Analyzing songs sung by Nina, Vanessa, Abuela Claudia, and Camila demonstrates that although still operating within what Alberto Sandoval Sanchez describes as Broadway's Anglo-American hegemonic theatrical domain, In the Heights charted new terrain for proliferation of Latina types and counter-stereotypes by staging the ambivalence and anticipation of migration. Significantly, In the Heights stages the choice to migrate as a key generational difference, wherein Abuela Claudia and Camila were, quote, stuck with another person's choice to move. Part of the generational increase in bodily autonomy for Nina and Vanessa includes sexual mobility. This is particularly consequential when thinking about amateur productions in educational settings. So it's a hot 4th of July weekend on one block in Washington Heights in northern Manhattan. The Star is where the musical takes place. The little L up in the corner is where Lin-Manuel Miranda actually grew up, in Inwood, where I lived for 16 years. And the audience follows several characters as they struggle for economic stability and upward mobility. Miranda originated the role of Usnavi, a young parentless Dominican immigrant who runs a bodega across the street from a taxi dispatch owned by the Rosarios, a Puerto Rican family. Usnavi has a crush on the salon employee Vanessa, who we saw K.O. playing, while the Rosario's daughter, Nina, becomes involved with their employee, Benny, who is black and not Latinx. So, of course, we saw Chris Jackson playing Benny. The score combines hip-hop and pop with Caribbean Latin musical styles, including salsa, bolero, mambo, son, bachata, and merengue. Indeed, the original cast recording opens with a 3-2 clave, that. So amidst diversity, there is cohesion. As Deborah Paredes notes, In the Heights attempts to consolidate a specifically pan-Latina/O identity and unity across racial and national divides. Francis Negron Montaner contends that West Side Story constitutes Puerto Ricans as criminal men and victimized women, 2 gendered sites of shameful identification. Miranda has discussed his desire to create new roles for Latina performers beholden to West Side Story's overdetermination of Latina representation in Broadway musicals for several decades, compelled by the conviction that Latina characters, quote, should be able to be on stage without a knife in our hand. This focuses on the male members of the Puerto Rican Sharks in the 1957 musical. However, I contend that In the Heights' female characters do the most work to upend West Side Story by redressing the sexual shaming of the innocent Maria and the Jet's sexual assault / taunting of the older and more experienced Anita. So Nina Rosario correlates to West Side Story's Maria. She's a Puerto Rican teenager feeling out of place everywhere she goes. As a first-generation college student, Nina has dropped out of Stanford University due to the stress of working 2 jobs, trying to make her grades, and feeling alienated. Her arrival home after months away positions Nina's anxieties about upward mobility as foundational to the musical. Nina sings the second song in the show, Breathe, and as Woolf observes in Change for Good, the female protagonist's first number becomes especially memorable and resonant in terms of characterization, story, and emotional effect. Nina is the classic soprano ingenue. Since niña is Spanish for girl, only the tilde of the ñ separates the Nina we see from the young girl her parents see. She is their muñeca, or doll, the same pet name Maria's offstage father uses to call her back from the iconic fire escape in West Side Story. In the moderate waltz, Breathe, both Nina's anxieties and the advice she receives in Spanish from the neighborhood community center on mobility. Miranda's lyrics embed quandaries of movement as existential dilemma. I'm going to skip my close read of the lyrics for time. Nina is one of many musical ingenues who, as Woolf puts it, finds her identity through a journey of personal struggle and eventual self-knowledge. Nina also has sex for the first time during intermission. Nina and Benny's first kiss ends Act 1, and as we saw, when we see Mandy Gonzalez and Christopher Jackson as Benny appear at the top of Act 2, we understand that they had slept together. And they actually had to add measures of music for the student matinees because the cheers were so loud. So, in trying to figure out their romance, Nina and Benny sing the duet Sunrise, in which Nina teaches Benny a few Spanish words and phrases. The simple 4/4 G major song's dynamics call for it to begin calmly and crescendo poco a poco. Paredes notes that their intimacy is expressed and cemented by this short lesson, while Rua reads the scene as an embodiment of how language determines a sense of belonging, but also functions as the most literal example of how the entire musical endeavors to teach Spanish to a presumably non-Spanish speaking audience. I'm interested in the specific exchange between the new lovers when it's slowed down, and the exchange is calor, heat, anoche, last night, dolor, pain, that's right. By saying dolor, Nina acknowledges the reality that having sex for the first time was painful. Benny comprehends this, and with the that's right, Nina confirms it while also confirming that he is translating accurately. This lyrical exchange is full of intimacy and honesty. I argue that Sunrise not only inverts West Side Story's fire escape scene, of course, but it redresses the shaming of Maria when Anita arrives to discover that Maria has just slept with Tony, and Anita begins to sing A Boy Like That, in which, as Woolf notes, Anita verbally and musically attacks Maria, and the lyrics' offbeats stress her fury. Woolf convincingly argues that the duet's complicated composition, quote, ultimately upends the heterosexual romance entirely, queering the affective organization of the musical. However, the fact remains that their encounter began with Anita shaming Maria for her heterosexual union with Tony. Indeed, when Nina's father, Kevin, argues with Nina about her relationship with Benny, he exclaims, sin vergüenza, shameless. Are you trying to shame me? To which Nina sarcastically and defiantly retorts, yes, Dad, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Again, I interpret this refusal to be shamed, particularly by patriarchal authority, as a mobilization of bodily autonomy that brings complexity to Nina's path of self-discovery. Nina, of course, contrasts with Vanessa, who already knows what she wants. She's just trying to figure out how to get it. Vanessa lives 20 blocks north of Daniela's hair salon on the more working-class east side of Broadway with her alcoholic mother, who is never seen on stage. Vanessa is sexy, everyone knows it, and she does too. In her article, Latina Subjectivity, Sexuality, and Sensuality, Alicia Arizon explicates the colonized history of Latina sexuality and turns to Laura Mulvey's classic visual pleasure narrative cinema to think through the beautiful señorita trope and the ways in which such tropes fragment the Latina body specifically. By Arezon's rubric, Vanessa possesses subjectivity and sensualidad in contra to objectified sexualization. The dysfunctional home life that Miranda and Hudes crafted for Vanessa makes her more than Usnavi's beautiful crush. Vanessa has a clear objective, to get out of the barrio and presumably be upwardly mobile. Her I Want song comes early in Act 1 and is all about mobility. In I Won't Be Long Now, audiences hear a double-time merengue as Vanessa plans her journey of escape. From the loud, ever-present subway to the glamorous limousine to a powerful plane, Vanessa's fantasy of escaping the barrio is much less existential than Nina's. The feeling is clear and profound, it just needs material support. And we saw how the staging of it, whereas Manny Gonzalez is very still during Breathe and very much in one, KO is walking through the public streets and engaging with and pushing back against the unwanted attention of the men on the street. So it's worth noting that we get very limited insight into Vanessa's background. Unlike every other female character who has a name in the Heights, we don't know Vanessa's cultural identity or immigration status because she doesn't tell us. We never get her full backstory. However, Vanessa is arguably coded as Dominican by Miranda's turn to merengue and bachata in her song. If Vanessa is Dominican, her romantic union with Usnavi is an intriguing alliance of national identity within a musical that argues for Pan-Latin identification. So, So this is just some of the sheet music that shows the merengue and the bachata. The final scene of In the Heights' first act begins at a nightclub. Miranda describes the club scene as, quote, a little dance at the gym from West Side Story. It's a little rent. It's entirely Heights. And the stage directions say, a chorus of boys swoops in on Vanessa, stealing her from Usnavi, alternating as they swing her around the floor. Yikes. Then, quote, Usnavi swoops in and takes Vanessa out of Club Guy's hands and dances with her. Double yikes. Okay. While these stage directions do not suggest that Vanessa has bodily autonomy over her fast-paced mobility on the dance floor, Andy Blankenbuehler, Luis Salgado, and Oscar Hernandez's choreography and the dancers' gestures and expressions create a more even power dynamic. Vanessa commands the dance floor with expertise and precision, making a display of her ability to navigate the fraught social space. Vanessa is Miranda and Hudes' rebuttal to Anita in West Side Story. Anita is eventually punished for being in the wrong place at the wrong time in Act 2's taunting scene, when the ambiguous stage directions suggest that the White Jets either pretend to rape her or actually instigate a sexual attack on Anita at Doc's drugstore. In the Heights' club scene references West Side Story's dance at the gym while it redresses the taunting scene. Vanessa recuperates Anita, shunting the shame of the Jets' attack through her choreographic mobility. In contrast, for the middle-aged and elderly women characters, mobility was not sought. They were told they were leaving their homelands. In the Heights departs from West Side Story in that these young romantics have a community of elders supporting and guiding them. Abuela Claudia is from Havana, Cuba, and immigrated with her mother to New York in 1943. While it would have been predictable for this character to stagnantly exist only in service of the other characters and without interior life, Act 1 features the powerful memory ballad Paciencia y Fe, Patience and Faith, delivered as a conversation with Claudia's mother, who has long since passed away. This creates the staging opportunity for direct address to the audience as Mercedes, who is Cuban-American and originated the role of Claudia, stood downstage center in a spotlight that suggests a heavenly aura while providing focus and emotional intensity. Beginning in a fortissimo dynamic that contrasts with Claudia's shuffling and shaking senior citizen body, Paciencia y Fe signals Claudia's Cuban identity by incorporating 2/3 and 3/2 son rhythms as well as mambo. In Claudia's memory, she played with friends and watched the daily activities in her neighborhood of La Vibora before, quote, Mama needs a job. Mama says we're poor. Mama says, vamos a Nueva York. And Nueva York was far, but Nueva York had work, and so we came. And you see on the extended note, we travel with Claudia and her mother to New York. You see how long came is on at the bottom of the slide there. Arriving in a cold December, Claudia and her mother are treated with hostility and indifference, told they better learn Inglés, and pulled their weight. Is this an upwardly mobile narrative? There is poverty in Cuba and working poverty in New York. A menacing chorus of New Yorkers pose an existential question to Claudia. Are you better off than you were with the birds of La Víbora? The clipped quarter notes emulate the way time tumbles forward, yet the weight of staying carries Claudia across 14 counts. Machado Saez contends that Usnavi's, quote, bodega is the center of a barrio ethos that glosses over the past and present of immigrant poverty in order to endorse a communal project of continued upward mobility. However, Abuela Claudia's biography demonstrates a lifelong struggle of economic precarity and options limited by language, class, ethnicity, and nationality. Camila Rosario is a no-nonsense but loving wife and mother who manages the family and business by cooking, processing paperwork, and mediating conflict between her husband and daughter. Nina's parents are significant characters in the Heights, with several book scenes featuring their dialogue and both Kevin and Camila having a song of their own. In the longest book scene in the musical, Act 1, Scene 11, we learn that 27 years ago in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, Kevin Rosario, quote, threw down his shovel, hitched a ride into town, and bought 2 plane tickets to Nueva York. He showed up at Camila's house with a suitcase and said, vamos. Kevin's determination over Camila's migration parallels Claudia's mother's directive to her as a child. Vamos, let's go, we're going. Act 1, Scene 11 is a dinner scene at the Rosario's home. Listening along to an old bolero, Camila sings along to the lyric that repeats because of a scratch in the record. Para siempre, para siempre, para siempre. Repeating forever, Camila happily explains, quote, the scratch in the record is my favorite part. While the scratch immobilizes the needle from traveling across the LP and completing the song, Camila enjoys the scratch. She revels in forever, in knowing she is stuck in a groove with her family and community. A quarter of the way into Act 2, when Nina comes home Sunday morning after having slept with Benny for the first time, Nina and Kevin argue, but a performance of patriarchal order dissolves into a matriarchal rebuttal and ultimatum in Camila's song, Enough. Oh my God, enough. Now you listen to me. I said enough. I'm sick of all this fighting. Yap, ba, 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 ba. I think you've said enough. Now listen to what I say. What I say goes. Camila diagnoses both Kevin and Nina's problems as movements away from the emotional center of the nuclear family. Quote, when you have a problem, you come home. You don't go out and make matters worse on your own. That is, the woman who 27 years ago was told vamos now proposes a theory of mobility that the Rosarios will get farther as a family if they come home. While a mother performing emotional labor in a heterosexual nuclear family may not seem to break new dramaturgical ground, I see Enough as an important song that looks back to musical theater history, countering Mama Rosa's monstrous mother. In contrast to Tevye and Golde, who have only been married 25 years, by the way, Enough asserts an emphatic personal boundary and ultimatum to both husband and daughter. Get your acts together or one day I'll be gone, ultimately offering an unsentimental stance on marriage and motherhood and the choice to mobilize. So that's sort of the end. I do have thoughts that are a bit beyond our time constraints here about how the film version immobilized women by cutting the role of Camila and references to Vanessa's mother, so I could sort of term this Motherless Manhattan. But I'll just offer my so what, who cares here for real world implications. My presentation was about the musical In the Heights, but its larger theme is woman's bodily autonomy. During the past several years, an overwhelming amount of facts and testimony have been made public about men's violation of women in professional and personal settings. We have learned about doctors, priests, coaches, and some of our most famous comedians, musicians, media personalities, and politicians who are sexual harassers and abusers. Some have even been convicted or found liable. I just discussed a joyful and poignant musical, but I see the stakes of Nina and Vanessa's ability to make choices about their bodies to have real stakes. I hope you will think about and appreciate how often In the Heights is performed at high schools and colleges since its amateur production rights became available 12 years ago. This presentation is dedicated to the student performers who have played and will play the characters of Nina and Vanessa. It is for all the audience members for In the Heights, from the first off-Broadway production to the movie screening 2 weeks ago at the United Palace in Washington Heights. It is for the student who once disclosed to me before class that she'd been the victim of an assault. It's for my teenage daughter, her friends, her former classmates in Inwood and East Harlem, her current classmates in the Bronx, and her future classmates wherever she decides to go.
Thank you, Catherine. We may have time for one quick question. 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, great. So if there are any quick questions for Catherine. Yes.
Thanks so much. That was really powerful. I am a Subway nerd, so I hope you can talk about the movie adaptation and particularly the use of the subway car in the, I want to call it a dream ballet, kind of Patience
For Patience Faye.
Yeah. So how, and maybe how transportation within New York and in and out of New York fits into this argument you're making about mobility and immobilization.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sunny. I mean, I see we're at time, so I'm going to keep it super short, and if anyone wants to talk to me after the session, I'm glad to chat, obviously. But I would say that that tunnel, changing it to a deathbed scene, I found incredibly poignant, even as I was a little frustrated with some of the lottery ticket changes to Claudia's plot. And the production design of the 1940s subway is really incredible, and the costuming and the dancing. So I would say the train, yes, it functions throughout. And one of the things that strikes me the most about the film adaptation is that the location changed. And what's not legible to, I think, folks who don't live in this part of Manhattan is that this is a radical class shift. Broadway, the same Broadway we're here talking about, goes all the way up through, and Inwood and Washington Heights are split east and west. And the west side is more middle class, there's more owned apartments, and the east side is rentals and is more industrial along the water. And so Miranda said it in a very bougie part, the most bougie part of Washington Heights, okay? The one at 181st Street stop. Castle Gardens is a private garden for the most expensive only doorman complex in Washington Heights. As I understand it, either the director or the site scoper picked the intersection of 175th and Amsterdam or Audubon because of its wide spacing, but it has really interesting implications for saying this is actually the more working class. This is actually closer to what the musical purports to represent. So that's all I'll say. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you. All right. We have 2 more papers in this panel. Our third is by Samuel Yates. Samuel Yates is a deaf artist and scholar who is currently resident dramaturg and assistant professor of theater at Pennsylvania State University. Their research on disability, aesthetics, and accessibility practices in the performing arts asks how our notions of disability and the able body inform and transform theatrical performance. You can discover more about their publications and creative work at samuelyates.com. Or sorry, samuelryates.com. Was Samuel Yates a taken URL? Oh no. Okay, samuelryates.com. And the title of Samuel's paper is Stealing from the Cookie Jar, Women Modeling Disability in Sondheim's Anyone Can Whistle. Please welcome Samuel.
In 1964, a strange and short-lived musical flickered, then flopped on the Broadway stage. Anyone Can Whistle, with music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim and a book and direction by Arthur Lawrence, ran for just 9 performances. It featured satire, Brechtian rupture, psychiatric asylum jailbreaks, a fake miracle, and songs that just didn't land the way that Rodgers and Hammerstein taught the public to expect. Contemporary critics were baffled, the ticket buyers stayed away, and the production ultimately shuttered within a week. And yet, there's something enduring about this musical's confusion, because what Anyone Can Whistle stages, albeit in the form of an absurdist comedy, is a surprisingly rigorous critique of how society constructs, labels, and then exploits disability. It presents a town desperate for economic salvation, willing to invent a miracle cure and imprison anyone who might threaten that illusion. It gives us a tyrannical but insecure politician who markets disability as an obstacle to be monetized, a medical care provider caught between public authority and personal ethics, and an ordinary citizen wrongly institutionalized for being an individual thinker. These circumstances feel frighteningly familiar. At its core, the musical asks, who decides who's sane and who isn't? Who profits from these decisions? And, of course, who gets left behind or locked away? In Seriously Mad, Alexei Grenenko robustly demonstrates how Anyone Can Whistle reflects the emerging anti-psychiatry and living independently movements from the 1960s, which favored deinstitutionalization and empowering individuals to live self-determined lives. Yet, however much Whistle wrestles with the psychiatric contradictions of the 60s, it does so without the full support of a still nascent disability rights movement, which comes to adopt the later frameworks of the civil rights movements and women's power movements of the 60s and 70s. Although Whistle predates the formal emergence of disability rights or even disability studies as an academic field, the women in this musical are profoundly engaged with the very tensions that define disability justice movements. Sondheim and Lawrence transform an antiquated religious model of disability to anticipate many of the insights of the later social, cultural, and even phenomenological models of disability, showing in 1964 how disability is not a defect in the individual, but something produced, managed, and manipulated by the needs of capitalism, by political expediency, and by a fear of difference. While Ethan Mordden writes, quote, "Anyone Can Whistle" was truly ahead of its time, end quote, David Saverin, in kind of counterpoint, characterizes the musical as undoubtedly a transitional piece. Saverin argues, quote, "No other musical of the period epitomizes the social and cultural contradictions of its era as vividly as Whistle," end quote. In short, for Saverin, the fact that it's decidedly of its time was the problem. Categorizing the musical as a curious hybrid, Saverin helpfully repositions Whistle alongside the experimental off-Broadway productions happening over at La Mama, and in response to works like the new 1958 English translation of Artaud's Theater and its Double, sociological works resisting authoritarianism and social conformity, like Reisman's The Lonely Crowd and Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, and, of course, Martin Eslin's treatise on absurdism, Theater of the Absurd, which was published in 1961. For Saverin and Mordden, Whistle fails to integrate its politics alongside its plots, characters, and musical styles. What's interesting to me, however, is both scholars primarily focus their analysis on the character Hapgood, paying special attention to his extended interrogation scene, Simple, in which he questions the sanity of the local townspeople. By focusing our attention on Hapgood, however, we fail to see how simple is a dramaturgical response to questions about disability politics first posed by Whistle's female characters. Naming this disability dramaturgy in a 1964 musical matters because our cultural memory and archival finding aids are tied to language. If we say that disability representation starts only when artists begin using that exacting language, we risk flattening long histories of coded, metaphorical, or politically dangerous engagements with disability. Of course, we don't need explicit language to know that American culture itself is steeped in ableism, the perverse idea that non-disabled people are inherently superior and that disabled individuals are defined solely by their biology. From the prolific eugenicist Charles Davenport's work in the early 1900s and the Capitol Crawl protest of March 1990, demanding that Congress pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, the 20th century American story has been a battleground of disability valuation. Today, in 2025, when the Trump administration's White House webpage on accessibility has ceased to exist, you can go check, it's a 404, while they simultaneously seek to purge the federal government of DEI initiatives by flagging dozens of words to limit or avoid, including disability, disabilities, and health equity, it is clear that disability languaging, what we say and what we leave unarticulated, has significant cultural and political consequence in the United States. Naming and valuing our diverse histories for posterity is especially important here in our Library of Congress, which serves as a repository of knowledge and our cultural heritage for all Americans, as our inimitable 14th Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, championed in her Of the People initiative. Nurse Faye doesn't speak the vocabulary of disability justice, but she stages its precursors in our theatrical imaginations. Recognizing and naming disability histories helps us understand how ableism hides in plain sight, how psychiatric control and bureaucratic violence operate, and how musical theater, as both mirror and megaphone, is a space where cultural anxieties about normalcy are worked out in public and in tune. So the remainder of this talk engages with Anyone Can Whistle through a contemporary lens of disability politics, focusing on its three central women: Mayor Cora Hoover Hooper, say that 5 times fast, Nurse Faye Apple, and the child Baby Joan, to trace how the musical stages a sophisticated critique of ableism and capitalist exploitation. So we begin with Angela Lansbury's Mayor Cora Hoover Hooper, the satirical and morally compromised politician who exemplifies the intersection of ableist exploitation and capitalist greed. From her first appearance, she confesses that she can accept anything except unpopularity, an explicitly political and economic calculation. Facing financial ruin, Cora's administration concocts the notion of a miraculous healing spring triggered by an innocent child licking a rock in order to lure tourist dollars. This wild scenario dramatizes the religious and medical models of disability, which view disability as a problem residing within the individual, requiring spiritual or medical intervention to return them to a so-called normal state. Cora's fake musical underscores how reinforcing institutional power defines and manages disability as deficiency. Consider the musical number The Miracle Song. Cora and her cronies announce gleefully that the spring cures anything and everyone, monetizing hope and implicitly disability itself. They sing healthy and rich, handsome, independent, wise, adjusted, and secure, and athletic, all of the things that you would wish to be. The lyrics here reveal her capitalist logic starkly. Health and normalcy become products to be bought, sold, and marketed for a ticket price of admission. When Nurse Faye brings actual asylum patients, nicknamed the Cookies, to test this supposed miracle, Cora's response is panic and fear. Her desperation to hide real disabled individuals reveals how the medical model functions as a convenient tool for marginalizing those who challenge normative ideals of health and wellness and warehousing them away in institutions far from the public gaze. Ultimately, when the miracle begins to collapse, the town resorts to mass incarceration, filling the asylum's quota with random citizens in order to maintain political balance of power. This chilling turn echoes Sarah White's analysis of how disability categories are imposed politically to manage and silence undesirables. Thus, Cora is a prescient Trumpian emblem of how capitalist interest shapes and abuses the definitions of disability. Let's next turn to Lee Remick's nurse Faye Apple, who initially appears as the custodian of medical authority you see here in a kind of traditional nurse costume. She rigorously controls the asylum inmates, meticulously documenting their medical conditions. Faye's transformation begins when confronted by Hapgood, the self-identified patient number 50. Hapgood, a self-described practicing idealist, shatters Faye's assumptions by revealing the arbitrariness of medical labels and institutional authority. He asks her to literally tear apart her medical records, symbols of the oppressive medical model. Faye's subsequent actions, destroying these documents, is a powerful dramaturgical moment. It exemplifies Chandra Kavanaugh's phenomenological critique that the medical model's neat categorizations inevitably erase individual complexity. Faye's tearing of the records symbolizes breaking free from imposed definitions, releasing the inmates from bureaucratic categories that define their worth and freedom. As Melissa Anderson Chavaria articulates in her predicament model, disability must acknowledge individual lived experiences. Faye's transformation embodies this shift from generalized medical paternalism into an individualized form of advocacy. Yet, crucially, Faye's arc also illustrates the complex ethical dilemmas disability advocates face. When Cora orders a roundup of citizens to fill the asylum quota, Faye is forced into a distressing compromise. She names the original patients to prevent arbitrary incarceration, save for Hapgood, her love interest. This decision resonates with Anne Waldenschmidt's cultural model argument, namely that disability is always a negotiation of power and representation. So finally, we turn to the character of Baby Joan, played here by Janine Tansey, the unwitting catalyst for the musical's events. The child's innocent act, licking a rock, Lacan, becomes the basis for Cora's miracle fraud. Baby Joan herself notably does nothing inherently miraculous. Rather, her innocence and presumed purity are appropriated by adult society to craft a narrative of disability as something needing a miraculous cure, something that can be commodified and then exploited. This exploitation reflects Waldenschmidt's cultural model critiques, wherein disability becomes a site of cultural performance in which we project onto bodies narratives of healing or otherness. Baby Joan's innocence starkly contrasts with the adult complex machinery surrounding her. Her childlike innocence facilitates common narrative tropes of deserving disabled individuals who are then juxtaposed against the undeserving, the stigmatized degenerates who belong in asylums, right? So they are not like us. Ultimately, Baby Joan's presence dramatizes the false promise of miracle cures, an ableist trope thoroughly dissected in disability scholarship. Sarah White offers a critique of the medical model as a false narrative of cure, as being inherently oppressive, given that it offers impossible normalcy rather than acceptance of one's biological conditions. As soon as the falsity of Baby Joan's miracle is exposed, the townspeople move on, chasing new illusions, abandoning the very bodies previously celebrated. This narrative cycle makes plain the exploitation at the heart of ableist capitalism. Disabled bodies, real or imagined, are disposable, valued only when profitable or symbolically useful. So, having explored how Sondheim and Lawrence quickly and expediently stage different forms of ableist exploitation through their key female characters, let's now turn to how the musical extends this critique, challenging the very boundary between sanity and madness, disability and normalcy. It is here, in the blurred lines between the townspeople and the asylum's inmates, that the satire reveals the arbitrary and oppressive nature of labels themselves. And for this, we then must return to Saverin and Morden's example, the pivotal sequence Simple, in which Hapgood, the enigmatic character posing as a new psychiatrist, introduces himself and begins a diagnostic game of sorting the townspeople from the cookies. Hapgood's whimsical diagnostic procedure deliberately mocks psychiatric conventions of the era. He asks a series of nonsensical questions over this extended I would call it recitative/patter sequence, in which he arbitrarily divides everyone into Group A and Group 1, quickly blurring the lines that society relies upon to distinguish sanity from madness. In a theatrically bold move, Hapgood declares directly to the audience and everyone on stage, "You are all mad." Here, the show breaks the fourth wall to implicate everyone, including us, in the absurdity of self-definition through diagnostic labeling. I should also kind of note here, when Sondheim later looks back on that fourth wall break, he says it's the most smart-ass thing that he had ever done, and he regretted doing it. So grain of salt. This theatrical technique aligns closely with the cultural model of disability, which recognizes how categories like disabled and abled or sane and insane are socially and culturally constructed. Disability becomes a site where values, ideals, or expectations to a culture's identity are contested and affirmed. What Sondheim's satire does here explicitly through Hapgood's performance is destabilizes the cultural categories to reveal their profound arbitrariness. Again, Group 1 and Group A, right? The categories aren't actually copaesthetic. Zelda and Raymond Knapp note that musicals typically romanticize or neatly resolve portrayals of mental illness. However, Anyone Can Whistle refuses this neatness. Instead, it forces characters, and by extension, us in the audience, to reckon with its uncertainties. When Hapgood's sorting exercises collapses into confusion, the supposedly normal townspeople, desperate to maintain their status, begin to behave absurdly, undermining any claim to rationality. The musical dramatizes here a powerful truth found in disability studies, succinctly summarized by Carmelo Marsala and Donatella Petretto. It is society's treatment rather than individual conditions that create disability. Sondheim echoes this observation after a fashion in his notes on Whistle in the compendium Finishing the Hat, writing that, quote, "Labels make the labeled feel comfortable and simplify the complications with which might blur any image, reducing the personalities to familiar packages, which shortens the distance between the dreamer and the dream," end quote. By exploring Anyone Can Whistle through feminist disability theory, we uncover a rich commentary on ableism, madness, and caregiving that remains strikingly relevant. Scholars like Kim Hall and Sammy Schalk note that modern culture obsesses over putting things into order, demarcating normal versus abnormal body minds. Whistle dramatizes this impulse with inmates who turn out to be, in one critic's words, the more sane of the impatients, exposing the ableist absurdity of the town's norms. Attending this division not only unlocks Sondheim's subtext, but it also models an inclusive ethic on stage. The musical offers a proto-disability justice stance avant la lettre. Faye Apple's moral journey from a rigid, rule-following nurse to a person willing to listen and to even join in with the inmates exemplifies the ethical growth that we might strive for today, moving from pity or control to allyship and respect. Moreover, a feminist disability dramaturgy highlights how Faye's compassionate rebellion against Cora's regime is precisely the kind of embodied ethics that our world today often undervalues, but sorely needs. Society in the 60s was not ready to be laughed at by the inmates of an asylum, nor to face the suggestion that their normality was a sham. But perhaps today's audience need this provocation. We are more fluent in conversations about mental health, more attuned to the harms of exclusion, and perhaps more willing to embrace unconventional, challenging art. For theater practitioners, this means an opportunity to reclaim a flop and reveal and revel in its brilliance with the benefit of modern sensibilities. Imagine a production that fully embraces a disability perspective, casting actors with disabilities and mental health experiences, consulting experts for authenticity, and emphasizing moments of crip joy and solidarity amongst those outsiders. Such choices could fulfill the transformative potential of crip performance, making the audience question their own mindset. So, by way of a conclusion, a call to action, I invite you to re-engage with Anyone Can Whistle with fresh tools and a sense of urgency in your classrooms and in your seasons and in your kind of theater going. Dust it off. This musical speaks to our moment in a very particular way because it teaches us about the fraught history of mental health challenges, while also demanding that we humanize the charactered so-called loonies of this piece. It dares us to see the world turned upside down and still recognize ourselves within it. If we approach it not just as an artifact of 1954, but as a living text on embodiment, ethics, and the possibility of change, it teaches us now about intentional framing and discussions, about how it gives us now new intentional framing and new ways to hold discussions on disability and care. It helps us foster empathy and a critical approach to what Golden Age musicals can give us in 2025. As Whistle's final song gently suggests, with so little to be sure of, let's be sure of the things that matter: our shared humanity, our capacity for care, and our courage to question what's normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel, for another wonderful paper. We have a few minutes for questions.
I actually have a question.
Oh, please.
You reminded me of the Cut song, The Lame, the Halt, and the Blind, and I'm wondering if you could comment on how that would have, or if the logic of removing it, or if it should have been kept, or how it would have played.
So the logic of Sondheim and Lawrence logic of removing the song was that it was sort of a double beat. He felt like it was already doing what the Miracle song did, and it sort of, the show was already in a 3-act structure. They were getting very anxious during tryouts, and they were trying dramatically to reduce it to a 2-act structure. They cut that song, they cut several of Faye's songs as well. Ultimately, it stayed as a 3-act because they couldn't get it down due to some set transitions that needed to happen between the acts. But the cutting of the song, I think, really very explicitly cuts out disability terminology of other types that we don't typically otherwise see, because otherwise the focus comes to be the inmates from the asylum who are all seen as mentally disturbed in some way, shape, or form, although they're really more radically positioned as political nonconformists. So whether or not they are actually disabled, I think, remains a bit of an open question for me. But it certainly, the removal of that number takes out one of the few songs where we see other categorizations of disability juxtaposed against the Miracle.
Other questions? I'm thinking about the Miracle then, and Baby Joan licking the rock. I have questions, but I don't exactly know about what. But as you were speaking, I was thinking of age and ability, and I suppose my question would be how you view that within this musical. It seems like Baby Joan kind of kicks things off, but then is not, like, age is not a very important factor within this musical, but then I'm asking, I suppose, a question of either young age or advanced age, or if that's factoring into ability.
Yeah, I mean, I think that particularly in musical theater, disability tends to fall along tropes of either feminization or infantilization, which are often kind of commingled. We see this specifically with regard to cognitive disability in other musicals. If we kind of look across the canon, we go from, here to somebody like Clara in Light in the Piazza or Next to Normal, all of which are, intensely feminized characters. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, I would argue, is sort of an extension of those tropes as well. So I think there's a kind of pretty sharp schism across musical theater history. When we see cognitive disability, we see it usually linked to the female body and usually younger women. And when we see physical disability, it is often more associated as masculine because it is something to be produced or performed. And so there's this weird gender divide that happens. I'm thinking even as I'm articulating a musical like Violet or Passion, right, later in Sondheim. She is, Donna Murphy in Passion, you know, is supposed to be hideous. They gave her a mole. I guess that works. But, you know, but she's like vaguely ill, but that her vague illness is purportedly read by everybody as like a cognitive problem, right? And so there's a sort of arrested development that all of these women experience. I'm thinking of in Next to Normal, of course, you know, Diane's living the trauma of the death of her son. Clara was kicked in the head by a horse. Violet is, you know, repeatedly returning to this moment of violence with the axe on her face. So there's a sort of, which doesn't really help us with Baby Joan, but rather to say Baby Joan is, I think, helps us get to the kickoff of a variety of other female characters. The fact that she's both female and young sets, I think, the stage for a lot of other stereotypes that we see later.
Sam, thank you so much for this paper, and thank you for your work in a much broader sense and all of your contributions to musical theater studies in conversation with disability studies. You've really raised the bar of our inquiries. So thank you for that, and also thank you for all the examples you just threw in, which are so great. You kind of got where I wanted you to get by the end, but I want to hear more about how you could imagine a contemporary production of the show. I love this show. I think your reading is so entirely spot on. Can you just talk a little bit more for those of us who want to see a production of this, how you could imagine casting it or what you could do with it? I know you think as a practitioner also.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge of this production, or of this musical, is its scale. You know, it's a 3-act musical. It's a musical a lot of people don't know particularly well, and it's doing a lot of stylistic things that you kind of have to prime the audience for. I feel like in some ways part of the failing of the original production is that it didn't go more meta. Like, I think that if it actually leaned into that Brechtian impulse and really taught audiences what to expect in terms of the genre shift, right? I think that would have helped them codify what was happening because, for example, you know, Cora is so clearly old vaudeville jazz, you know, stylizations. So everybody sort of tracked into different musical genres, and I don't know that audiences had the sort of temperament at the time to oscillate between those different stylistic markers. So I think for me, dramaturgically, you have to teach any audience how to watch the show on its own terms, and for that would mean creating some sort of aestheticizing distance so as to help audiences not only expect those genre shifts musically, but also come to expect in some, or at least be able to deal with the eventual break of the fourth wall. For my money, I almost wish that it goes further, and as much as I kind of loathe audience participation, because I actually think it's kind of radically unsafe for performers, having some sort of audience engagement around the group 1, group A situation, I think might help drive home the larger ideological point of the labeling being a like kind of lost enterprise. The one thing that obviously this 1964 cast doesn't do is it doesn't address race in any significant way. I think any production now would have to do that, but I actually would be really, really reticent to cast a non-white mayor. I think that like shifts some of the political power in a way that I don't know that the libretto and some of the things that she says about the body hold up in different ways. So, but yeah, I'm thinking something towards a further aestheticization, whereas I think the original musical tried to bring us in a kind of traditional way to then break the fourth wall, and I think that was something that at the time audiences didn't know what to do with, and Sondheim across his career says he never figured out how to solve, because he talks several times about wanting to come back to Whistle, and he never felt like he could do it in a way that achieved what he had desired. I think he kind of gets toward it in other ways with the final Here We Are, which I don't know is absurdist in the way that the musical thinks it's absurdist, but it does have some other kind of shared kindred of absurdism.
Thank you very much. Another round of applause. All right. Are our brains warmed up this morning? Neurons firing? Our final paper on the Women and Identity panel is by Donatella Galella, which is a very fun name to say. Donatella Galella is an associate professor of theater history at the University of California, Riverside. Her first book is America in the Round, Capital, Race, and Nation at Washington, D.C.'s Arena Stage. And she is working on her second book, which is about yellowface in 21st century U.S. musical theater. The title of her paper today is They Don't Know, Thoroughly Modern Millie and Ironic Racism. Please welcome Donatella.
All right, in the 2002 Broadway musical Thoroughly Modern Millie, Harriet Harris played Mrs. Mears, a white woman disguised as Chinese. She invented an outlandish accent for the character, epitomized by the refrain, "Sad to be all alone in the world." Harris claimed that she first tested out the accent on her co-stars, Ken Leung and Francis Ju, quote, to see if they took offense at such bodacious political incorrectness. Their conclusion, once they stopped laughing, "It's so wrong, it's okay," unquote. Regaling journalists with this anecdote repeatedly, the white actress seemed to need the authorization of Chinese Americans. Harris received the Tony Award for Best Featured Actress in a Musical, signaling aesthetic and ethical approval from the professional theater community. Thus, a white woman in yellowface won this award 13 years before the first Asian American actress would do so, Ruthie Ann Miles. Full of tap dancing, romance, spectacle, and humor, the 1920s pastiche musical, Thoroughly Modern Millie, matters because of its popularity and popularizing of racial logics. The book was written by Richard Morris and Dick Scanlon. Scanlon also did the lyrics, Janine Tesori wrote the score, and there's direction by Michael Mayer. Adapted from the campy 1967 film starring Julie Andrews, the stage production follows Millie, a young woman who has moved to New York City with the hopes of marrying her rich boss. She stays at a hotel run by Mrs. Mears and aided by two Chinese immigrant men, Ching Ho and Bun Fu. They ultimately expose Mrs. Mears for coordinating an Asian sex slavery ring. And after some romantic mix-ups, Millie chooses her true love, Jimmy, who turns out to be rich. In my paper today, I theorize ironic racism to understand the political work that Thoroughly Modern Millie is doing. Emergent in the 1990s, this approach delivers jokes that are so racist that paradoxically they appear progressive. In Millie, Mrs. Mears' oral, visual, and dramaturgical yellowface performance is over the top and held at arm's length. She contrasts with Ching Ho and Bun Fu, who speak in Cantonese and sing in Mandarin. They rescue a kidnapping victim and they defy national abjection. At the same time, ironic racism offers pleasurable indulgence in Orientalist tropes and racial privilege. I attempt to honor the creator's stated intentions to subvert anti-Asian representation while also analyzing their limitations. While Mrs. Mears sings, "They don't know," how can we know better? Ironic racism operates ambivalently and ambiguously, seemingly undermining white supremacy while reinforcing this racialized power structure. Jonathan P. Rossing, a scholar of rhetoric, observes, quote, "Ironic racism results when a person, typically white, performs in a way that could be perceived as racist, but whose performance also implies either a subtle disavowal of racist meaning or an insincerity that suggests the person knows better," unquote. Their diction encapsulates the slipperiness of this phenomenon. Could be perceived as, implies, subtle, suggests, that depends on an audience interpreting intention, affect, and effect. When musicals boast racist jokes, claims to irony provide cover. The authors and the actors did not really mean it, they were just kidding. They may further profess that the joke was actually anti-racist because it's utterly ridiculous and obvious that they themselves are not racist. They were scripting or playing characters to point out racism and make fun of the real racists. Ironic racism entails plausible deniability. And then positioning themselves above the political fray, spectators may subsequently not feel implicated, but sophisticated and superior for recognizing and then rejecting racism, and therefore feel free to laugh. Using this recipe of liberal orientation, good intentions, self-aware meta-theatricality, and comic extremism, ironic racism can do some progressive work. Yet, it can also enable artists and audiences to enjoy comedy at the expense of racialized others. When the creative team of Thoroughly Modern Millie adapted Mrs. Mears from screen to stage, they did not aim for this yellow-faced dragon lady villainess to do racist harm, but intended to ironize racism. First, Dick Scanlon invented motivation for Mrs. Mears to pretend to be Chinese. Because the hotel she manages is a front for a human trafficking ring and the cops are on the lookout for Daisy Crumpler, she creates an alter ego to disguise herself. Like many of her boarders who are aspiring actresses, she herself has an acting background. In her breakout number, They Don't Know, she brags of the canonical roles she almost played and her ability to fool her residents. But she is a failed actress, and she seeks revenge on the young women whose careers remain full of potential. So the comedy comes from this absurd situation, fueled by dramatic irony, because we in the audience know of her slavery shenanigans, and we know better than to accept her as authentically Chinese. We are in on the joke. Moreover, Mrs. Mears is an unabashed villain. So by scripting her as criminal and as an actress, Scanlon provides distance and permission for performing Yellowface. In a pre-Broadway workshop, Harris pushed the idea of playing Mrs. Mears as an extreme Chinese stereotype such that excess becomes another way to justify Yellowface. She's not a real Chinese woman, but a self-conscious performance of an imagined one. On Broadway, she invoked a villainous Asian gestural vocabulary as she twiddled her fingers menacingly. She donned white makeup with red lipstick, jade jewelry, a black embroidered robe with wide sleeves, matching black pants and a shirt with a mandarin collar, and a print of green squiggles and Chinese-seeming red characters, and a black wig. She told Newsday, quote, "I wanted to wear Chinese pajamas and an empress kind of black wig, complete with chopsticks, to look like I was in the Peking opera." This is a description that's very far from what you're seeing here, and it's an Orientalist perspective on Beijing opera. In addition, her pseudo-Chinese accent became part of the script, such as in lines like, "Now where my rent?" In The Village Voice, Michael Musto mused, the accent would be a huge problem, except the character is actually a frustrated actress and a major biatch pretending to be Asian. And this is a sensibility that's aired repeatedly across most reviews, so it's an indication that Scanlon's libretto successfully excused this yellow-faced performance. Finally, the artists behind Millie have emphasized their intention for Mrs. Mears to offer a critique of racist representation through irony. By making this racist look ridiculous, they condemn Yellowface and give audiences the satisfaction of laughing at this offensive buffoon. For Scanlon, her characterization is so absurd it cannot be taken seriously. Because the stereotype is performed and neither true nor natural, he believes spectators can tell the difference between fiction and reality. In the licensed script, the stage direction guides the actor portraying Mrs. Mears, quote, "to embrace the offensiveness of her politically incorrect rendering of Asian, confident in the knowledge that when contrasted with the actual Asian characters we meet later on, her depiction of a hateful stereotype will be busted as inauthentic and absurd," unquote. Juxtaposed with Ching Ho and Bun Fu, Mrs. Mears is supposed to appear unbelievable in relief. Francis Ju, who played Bun Fu across Ken Leung's Ching Ho, shared that, along with Harris, quote, We just had the greatest time figuring out how to make this funny without relying on simple tropes, unquote. And they crafted these specific moments where they copied and caricatured Mrs. Mears' performance of Chineseness like this racial hall of mirrors. But Mrs. Mears' ironic racism avails multiple readings as purportedly anti-racist critique that actually reiterates racist tropes while making spectators feel sophisticated for understanding on a meta level the problematic performance of Chineseness and feel above the racist fray while still enjoying the stereotype. Thoroughly Modern Millie never directly provokes the audience to think critically about what exactly are you finding so amusing. The very stage direction glosses the real and the fake Chinese characters as generically Asian. Spectators may be laughing at Mrs. Mears for being incompetent and racist, and or they may be laughing at Chinese Americans for being forever foreigners. She may be the villain, but that does not prevent an audience from taking pleasure in her. They like Mrs. Mears, and they like that they are not like Mrs. Mears. I suggest that Mrs. Mears offers satirical vibes rather than a clear target of satire. Without additional signifiers, how can an audience tell the difference between exaggerating a stereotype and just exemplifying a stereotype? In her book Embodied Nostalgia, Phoebe Rumsey similarly observes that, quote, Millie does not offer this guidance on whether the Orientalism is supposed to be a spoof or parody of 1920s movie stereotypes. In a show that's basically a sentimental ode to classical musical comedies, Mrs. Mears is more like pastiche than she is like parody. Her performance can also inspire nostalgia for an earlier time before so-called political correctness policing, when straight-up yellowface was more readily acceptable. Millie rehearses other troubling Orientalist conventions. Mrs. Mears conjures up the image of scary Asians and Arabs abducting young white women that dates back to the 19th century. This Yellow Peril plot is played with constant comic racialized touches like, if we're not Shanghai to Hong Kong. Through a kind of reverse racism, the plot device also obscures real historic dynamics. Per the Page Act of 1875, US officials basically assumed all Chinese women to be sex workers, and therefore that has contributed to why we in society, even today, still think of Asian women as sexual objects. And then the musical implicitly makes light and white of slavery in the United States, which also obviously obscures history and the survival and struggles of Black women. In addition to preserving this aspect of the original film, Millie, the stage show, preserves jokes like Mrs. Mears telling Millie that soy sauce is one of the great mysteries of the Orient that can be used as a cleaner. So if interpreting Mrs. Mears' yellowface performance as wrong relies on her contrast with Ching Ho and Bun Fu, then we also need to give a closer look to these Chinese men. To their credit, the musical team did improve upon the original film's depiction. Scanlon gave Oriental number 1 and Oriental number 2, those are their names in the movie. He gave them Chinese-inspired names and gave them backstories. They recently arrived in the United States and they're saving up money to bring over their mother from Hong Kong with the help of their new employer, Mrs. Mears. Just like Millie, they sing, they dance, and they aspire to the American dream. They reprise Millie's I Am, I Want song, not for the life of me, but in Mandarin, paralleling the modern white woman with the ethnic immigrant. In addition, Scanlon individuated the characters. While Bun Fu takes a more cutthroat approach to human trafficking, Ching Ho falls in love with one of their victims, and he rescues Miss Dorothy, and Bun Fu then helps to save the day by providing evidence of Mrs. Mears' white slavery ring and revealing that he knows way more English than he had intimated. Theater scholar Angela Pao argues that these Chinese brothers, quote, counter two of the most deeply entrenched dominant cultural characterizations of Asians and Asian Americans: the characterization of Asians in America as perpetual and inassimilable foreigners, and the characterization of the Asian male as sexually undesirable. At the very end of the Broadway production, a huge image appears on the curtain showing the two brothers reunited with their mother, and they're wearing big smiles and holding American flags in front of the Statue of Liberty. So instead of being abject villains, they've become romantic heroes and warmly welcomed Americans. So for some Asian American audiences, seeing them triumph over Mrs. Mears, find romance, and gain national inclusion does reparative work, especially in the context of like the dearth of Asian and Asian American representation in mainstream musicals. For some actors like Francis Ju, Peter Kim, and Kim Varhola, being cast in Millie was a dream come true. But the well-meaning treatment of Ching Ho and Bun Fu at times lacks deep care and knowledge. Michael Mayer came up with the idea of having them speak in their native tongue while showing English translations. Quote, "With super titles, these guys can have their own language and a kind of dignity that Pidgin English doesn't allow for." Scanlon agreed, quote, "What the audience is expecting is like, me no likey. They're partially laughing at their own expectations," unquote. So on the one hand, this approach granted the brothers greater freedom for expression on their own terms while suiting them as recent immigrants. Like it makes sense. And on the other hand, calling Pidgin English undignified and equating it with oral yellowface privileges US assimilationist values and glosses these different dictions. Moreover, Scanlon's comment presumes a non-Chinese audience. When I first heard Ching Ho and Bun Fu's dialogue, I was confused and then delighted. Because of the cast recording, I knew they sang in Mandarin, yet I was hearing them speak in Cantonese. So I felt more at home, like recognizing words here and there. But having them commune through these two Chinese languages in 1922, that's not a thing. This is not a thing. So the creative team positioned, as we said, like Ching Ho and Bun Fu as a foil to Mrs. Mears' yellowface performance. And they're supposed to be like the authentic Chinese characters, but like they are stereotypes also. So the audience first meets them several scenes into the musical doing laundry. So this conjures a real history of Chinese men relegated to doing laundry, but also this history of representation in minstrel shows as doing laundry. Despite their humanizing motives and their heroic ends, they are villains who have sex trafficked white women. And they also serve as sidekicks to Mrs. Mears and musically sidekicks to the main storyline. They don't have any original songs. Their big number is Muqin, a Mandarin translation of My Mammy, the song popularized by Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer from 1927, with just a few adjusted lyrics. Interpolated into Millie, the song enables the immigrant men to apologize to their mother for making her wait, articulate how they love her smile, and express how they miss home. For Ju, quote, "Doing that song was only allowable if we did it completely sincerely and within the context of really desperately wanting to get our mother back," unquote, without trying to like ridicule Black people and pain. Meanwhile, Scanlon described the scene as extraordinarily funny and really crazily subversive. Mammy is a song that's so associated with racism, and to have it on stage in such a completely turned on its head way, it takes the onus off it, unquote. Muqin performs blackface in ways that the artists find to be unproblematic through sentimentality and comic irony. But instead of challenging white supremacy, Muqin largely reproduces it. First, Ching Ho, Bun Fu, and Mrs. Mears are enslavers, so having them sing a pro-slavery song is actually rather fitting. It's not turning anything on its head. Through My Mammy, Mrs. Mears teaches the immigrants how to be American. Like, what's more American than blackface? David Roediger, Eric Lott, and others have theorized and historicized how European immigrant, Jewish, and working class men gained conditional whiteness and Americanness by corking up. And similarly, Yellowface has historically enabled non-Asian actors to play Asian and paradoxically distance themselves from Asianness in order to bring themselves within the parameters of American citizenship. As a white woman, Mrs. Mears performs Yellowface and Blackface, a kind of ultimate American at the top of the racial ladder. Her Americanization pedagogy works because Ching Ho and Bun Fu cite Jolson's gestural vocabulary of kneeling and extending out one arm with deep sentimentality. Indeed, there's a stage direction that also says sings a la Jolson. Near the end of the number, they then start singing Mammy in English. And the projected, like the English translations that were on the stage, they suddenly turn into Chinese characters. So the artistic decisions like create multiple jokes that rest upon this racial incongruity and delightful surprise. The spectators can laugh at seeing white and Asian people performing blackface without blackened faces and without feeling too badly. Also, some of the translation decisions privileged legible proximity to my mammy over the precision in language to create even more amusement. So for instance, there's an English supertitle that reads, "My heartstrings are tangled around Siamese," which is Alabama in the original song. But the Mandarin words that they're singing actually mean more like, "My heart forever longs for my hometown." So also Ching Ho and Bun Fu are not from Thailand, but I guess like from a white American empire perspective, all Asian places and faces look alike. Thoroughly Modern Millie ultimately celebrates self-invention in ways that ally Chinese American history. The creative team repeatedly framed the musical as a US American bootstrap story with universal appeal and application. Ching Ho and Bun Fu have a happy ending. Ching Ho couples with Miss Dorothy, a rich white woman. Bun Fu earns a job as Trevor's new stenographer. They bring Mrs. Mears to justice, and they bring their mother to the United States. But assimilation may be neither beneficial or even possible. Situated at Ellis Island, the final stage image obscures the main historic point of entry, or rather barrier, for Chinese immigrants. That would be Angel Island out in California. That's where Chinese folks were detained for a couple of weeks and sometimes up to a couple of years, and many of them were sent back to China. So because of the Page Act that I mentioned before, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, male Chinese laborers and almost all Chinese women were effectively prohibited from entering the United States until the 1940s. So like these xenophobic laws were obviously still in place in 1922. So it would have been basically impossible for Ching Ho and Bun Fu and their mother to immigrate. In addition, the Cable Act of 1922 revoked citizenship from US women who married aliens ineligible for citizenship. So this is a reminder that Ching Ho and Miss Dorothy's romance would contend with legal and banal discrimination. Understanding this context is important because many audiences learn history through musical theater, and they downplay past and present anti-Asian racism. The 2024 Social Tracking of Asian Americans in the United States Index found that only 38% of people polled agreed that Asian Americans are discriminated against. Seeing Ching Ho and Bun Fu successfully assimilate, it does counter negative images of Chinese Americans as not real Americans, but it also obscures anti-immigrant and anti-Chinese obstacles. So it's through this ironic racism and the juxtaposition of Ching Ho and Bun Fu that Mrs. Mears' outrageous yellowface performance on top of My Mammy becomes palatable, given the appearance of progressive politics while also maintaining white supremacy. I'll conclude by telling you that when the rights to stage Thoroughly Modern Millie became available in 2007, it was one of the most frequently produced musicals in high schools across the country for several years. That is until 2014, when Asian American students, parents, and teachers began protesting the musical's portrayal of Chinese Americans. With more amateur productions, more time, and more Asian American voices, the ironic racism of Millie has resounded as straight up racism. In 2022, the authors pulled the license, and they're continuing to revise the musical with greater anti-racist sensitivity. They do know. Thanks.
Thank you. Wow. That was wild in my mind. But I will turn it over to audience questions first. 1, then I saw 2, and then 3, and then
I have a Zoom one too.
Oh, I am sorry. Okay.
Yep.
Would you like to begin with the Zoom or?
Sure. I'll start with Zoom just
Okay.
to represent them. So
Yes.
This question is, how much responsibility does the audience have to reject these inaccurate stereotypes versus the responsibility of the creator or director of the show?
I think we're all responsible. I think an audience might not know until they go. I also have heard that it depends on who the audience is. Like my colleague Broderick Chow has told me that in a Chinese-Canadian context of seeing Thoroughly Modern Millie, that Chinese-Canadian audiences like laugh at her. And so it depends on who you're with, who is laughing at what reason, but I do think it's largely the creator's responsibility, and I think they've taken that up very seriously, and they're making big changes.
Next question, would you like to go?
Donna, since you ended on the implications of amateur productions, can you speak to the issue of working with like children or teenagers and talking to them about fraught politics when they might really just be trying to quote unquote put on a show?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking of a couple of anecdotes. I'm thinking of one when there was a production, I think this was the one at Newton North High School in the Boston area. There was a story about an Asian American kid who had been in the high school's production of How to Succeed in Business. And his parents were like, why aren't you auditioning for Thoroughly Modern Millie? And he was like, I don't want my ama, my gung, like I don't want my grandparents to see this. So there were like a lot of stories about this. There were so many town halls also of like people sharing like why they were so deeply troubled by their school doing it. There's also this great interview when Sutton Foster went back to her high school and they were doing Millie and they interviewed one of the Asian American actors, and he was so excited to see that there was a call for Asian American actors. He was like, oh, there's something for me now. But then there's also like a lot of ignorance, and Sutton was asking him like, oh, like, do you know Mandarin? And it became clear like she didn't remember that you have to speak Mandarin and like you have to do Mandarin and Cantonese, and he had to like kind of educate her. But he also said like he knows one, and he was like, and I kind of like BS the other one, and I was like, so it like in some ways opens up some opportunities for casting and people feeling called in a way that they might not for other shows, and in others it's completely alienating of like, how is my school, how is this the one where I get to have a part?
Thank you for a really great paper, and I'm really glad to hear that the creators are making changes. And you sort of got where I was thinking throughout the paper by the end, but I wanted to hear a little bit more thinking about the irony, because I was really struck by how often Harris and the creators felt like they had to justify it and explain it. And irony doesn't always read, right? And so I think that's that balance, right? Of they're trying to do something, but irony has to be interpreted in a particular way, right? So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the original reviews in New York were largely mixed to positive and underscored the irony. I found only one review that was explicitly critical of the musical as anti-Asian. So they loved the irony, they loved Harriet Harris's performance. And then what seemed to happen was when the show went on the road and then there were these amateur productions, the artist, specifically Dick Scanlon, would get very defensive and kind of blame those amateur productions for like not doing it right. So that became a recurrent thing, and then he had to like write a letter to accompany the MTI package to explain what's going on. And then one of the things he suggested was like, okay, maybe you could just do Mrs. Mears in drag and cut out this yellow face part. So it's like, it's literally not even necessary for the story. But like the defensiveness is like, oh, it's out of my control now, and that's why it's like getting misinterpreted. People are not getting the irony.
Maybe one more question and then we will break, and please find Donatella. Oh, yes.
I'll be quick and I'll ask you about this on a break, but I wanted to ask about what you think of, because this is happening, white students being cast as Bunfu and Ching Ho and then singing Mammy in these languages, but I'll bug you about it on a break.
Yes, it's wild and it's common. And then it completely disrupts Scanlon's dramaturgical reasoning of like, okay, if Mrs. Mears is the fake Asian and then we have the real Asians, what happens when you cast white kids, often white girls, being Ching Ho and Bunfu, which is also about the effeminization of Chinese men, and it's just like normalized. Like I would love future project that we need to do more research on what does doing musicals about race, what racial lessons does that impart to our young people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.